Welcome to CityWorks, a co-production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. Each month, CityWorks explores the challenges and lived experiences of working people on the job, at home, and in our communities. New York City is experiencing its worst cost of living crisis in decades. Record numbers of New Yorkers are simply not able to afford basic essentials like housing, food, healthcare, and childcare. There may be no more explicit sign of how severe this crisis is than this: working New Yorkers with decent paying jobs living in homeless shelters. Thousands of New York workers and working families unable to afford even a one-bedroom apartment, despite salaries as high as $50,000 or $60,000. And it's not just here in New York City. Nationwide, as many as 40 to 60% of people who are experiencing homelessness have jobs. They're just not making enough to keep pace with rising rents. Joining me today are two experts on the affordability crisis and its everyday impact on working people, record numbers of whom are no longer able to afford to live in a home. Henry Love is Vice President of Public Policy and Strategy at WIN, the largest provider of shelter and supportive housing for families in the U.S. And we're joined by Angela Wyse, Assistant Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College, who studies homelessness and poverty in the U.S. Thank you both for joining us. Let's start with you, Henry. Tough topic always. To begin with, a tough topic to even get a handle on. So if I were to ask you, how bad is homelessness? Huge question. What do you say, and how do you even begin to measure it?
You know, there was just a piece that came out yesterday in the New York Times. 140 some odd thousand kids who are experiencing homelessness in the city of New York alone. You know, that's bigger than, I think they compared it to Dallas schools. So one of the biggest school districts in the country, just alone with students who are homeless. So it's massive, and I think that too often people just think that it's the person on the corner of the street, but too often it's families with children.
And what about you, Angela? I mean, you're in the business of documenting and collecting data and looking at data, and you published an important report recently. What did you do that was different this time, and what were some of your results?
For our study, we took a national approach. We're trying to get a representative picture as best as we can of this issue of homelessness and what it looks like nationally. What we found is that, as you mentioned, between 40 and 60% of people experiencing homelessness actually had formal earnings. So we actually looked in the tax records and saw they had a W-2 or they had a 1040 that indicated that they were employed and they were experiencing homelessness despite being employed. One key thing to mention is that it wasn't that they had high incomes. They had particularly high, salaries on average. I think the median income was about $8,000 in a year from employment. So based on those data, we are finding that people are experiencing homelessness despite working, but that their employment, that the earnings that we see are more consistent with really low wage work and maybe sporadic work as well.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, we've talked about incomes before and wages before, but in this study, that question of precarity and the gig worker and lack of security and stability really stood out to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it's, we're seeing this across the board from, many of our families, from Uber driving to a lot of the delivery services, 100%. And I think it's just in terms of the precarity, in terms of the amount of hours to be able to secure. A lot of times, they're dealing with not being able to get to a certain threshold and to get insurance, et cetera. So there's a lot of barriers there as well.
And when we come to housing, one needs to be able to show consistency of income and even some savings. What were you able to find out about that side of the picture, Angela?
What we're finding is that people who experience homelessness are persistently really have very kind of experiencing a high degree of poverty over the long term. So it's really underscoring the fact that when when you're kind of living on the edge over a long period of time, it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take a huge economic shock, eviction, job loss. It doesn't take a lot to actually precipitate, a spell of homelessness, to lose your housing when you're kind of living in this long-term precarity that we observe.
Henry?
Yeah, and I think on that, one of the things that's really important and I want to highlight is just, and this sort of, in terms of the affordability crisis, childcare, and just how expensive it is to have a child. And so when we look across the board, one of the biggest drivers for the families experiencing homelessness is having a new baby, just because, especially in the city of New York. In terms of the average cost, I think there was a report that came out from the comptroller is about $21,000 plus dollars a year just for childcare, and so it's incredibly destabilizing for families once they have that new baby.
And what do we know about the demographics? I mean, WIN used to be women in need. I mean, what difference does race and gender make?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we say all the time that I think shocks people is that the most common age that someone is most likely to be in shelter is under the age of 5. And so they often think it's an older single man on the corner and whatnot, and it's not the case. Right now, I literally looked up the census from last night, and there's about 85,000 folks who are in shelter right now. And of those 85,000, about 70% of them are families with children. 40% of those are just children. So roughly 30,000 kids who were in shelter. So the numbers are staggering. They've only increased in the past few years. And I think we're really concerned because I think across the board what we're seeing happening with the federal government and particularly what the administration is proposing with these HUD cuts that will catapult more and more families into homelessness.
I just interviewed the whistleblowers, 2 of the 4 whistleblowers from HUD, from the Department of Civil Rights in HUD, who said that basically their work of being the one federally funded free place that people could go to fight eviction, to fight discrimination in housing, to fight discrimination specifically against women who were fleeing domestic violence.
Yes.
I didn't even realize that was a special unit inside HUD. But they said basically that work had all been put on hold since the second Trump administration came in.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm
that was
glad
before the government shutdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you raised that. And I think one of the things we see so often is voucher-based discrimination. And I would push it even further to say it's intersectional, right? And so it's not just the voucher, but the fact that too often women of color, working women with children, they're experiencing these multiple intersections of sort of marginalization.
So voucher discrimination if they're receiving Section 8 vouchers, housing assistance that the landlord doesn't want to rent to them.
Exactly.
Where do they go? Angela, what about that aspect of the story in the data? What did you see?
Yeah, that story is really consistent with what we saw in this kind of national tax data. So women experiencing homelessness had higher incomes. And if you think about it, what that means is that women are experiencing homelessness despite having higher incomes, right? So they're unable to afford housing, perhaps because discrimination, as you mentioned, also just the difficulty of finding housing for yourself and for your accompanying children. So we're finding that, you mentioned in the intro, up to $50,000. So women are much more likely to experience homelessness at those higher income levels.
So we've been talking data and numbers and policy and statistics and tax records. Let's put some flesh on some of these bones. Who are we talking about? Who are some of the people that you work with, Henry?
They're families with children.
Tell us the story.
I teach at Lehman College too, and I think what was always shocking to me is every semester when we talk about homelessness and homeless policy, how many of my students are at any given moment are homeless. I would say probably 30%. And they're working, they're in school, they have kids, and so too often I think particularly right now what we've been doing is going around to our shelters and explaining what's happening with the federal cuts, and I can't put into words what people are going through right now, and the fear that people have, and they're hearing what's coming down, and the fear for these SNAP cuts, the fear for they're possibly losing their Section 8 vouchers or their supportive housing. And so there's so much fear right now, and I think that's where folks are, is sort of getting through the next day, because I think there's just so much uncertainty for so many right now. And
how did you get into this work?
I used to be a teacher, and so I think I didn't understand those numbers that were coming out, and I saw it in my classrooms, and so I taught in the not South Bronx, in East Harlem, and also in Central Brooklyn. And ironically, today I was looking through some of our school attendance records, and one of the schools that I used to work at was on a list of where our kids are coming from, and so we just see so many kids that are going through a host of issues, And that's sort of what got me into this space.
I have to say, just to devil's advocate for a second, there may be people watching, particularly in urban areas, but not only, who say that this is a very tight employment market, there's low unemployment. They see signs in the windows of different stores and outlets that say, workers wanted. Restaurants are constantly saying they're short of workers. How do you explain that disconnect to people, Angela? Because then people say, well, why don't they get a job? I see a help wanted sign right there.
I think it comes back to, what we're seeing is that people are still going to experience homelessness despite being employed, despite having a job. You can have a somewhat steady income and still not be able to afford housing. I think that's pretty clear to anyone who's, paying attention here. So, those tend to be minimum wage jobs, right? Minimum wage, maybe sporadic jobs, maybe not the stability that you want. They certainly don't include benefits. If we're talking about cutting Medicaid, that's not going to provide you your health insurance. So you still have those medical costs to worry about. So I think that what we learn is that, the systems we have in place, the labor market we have in place, it's actually just not enough.
Yeah, you mentioned, what's, an average family, and for us, it's a mom with 2 kids. And so on my way here, I was thinking, so what does that even look like in terms of the rental market? And it's at least, a 2-bedroom apartment. For a mom that's working and their kid, they have a separate room. And the average cost for that in the city of New York is $5,500 a month, which is absurd. And if 40 times the rent, we're talking 200,000 plus. And to her point in terms of, people are, these are low wage jobs that many folks are getting. I was looking at what's the starting pay for a New York City public school teacher, and basically what it would cost for a mom. So imagine if it was a first grade teacher with 2 kids, she wouldn't be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. It would, take 3 of her salaries to be able to afford that, which is absolutely unaffordable. And so, think about, jobs like teachers where it requires a master's degree, or just good, hard-working, union-paying jobs. Even those are not, making the mark in terms of what we see in terms of affordability in the city.
So what do? We're going to talk about that when we come back. We're going to take a short break. You're watching CityWorks. Welcome back to CityWorks. We're talking about the alarming number of working people, often with decent paying jobs, who simply can't afford a place to live. Coming back to you, Henry Love with WIN. We've talked a lot about people with kids, women with kids especially. What about single people? They've historically had some hard times getting even on the list for housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've seen this across the board, just in terms of, the issues that folks are facing in regards to access to mental health care services, et cetera. And again, I think there is so much concern in the field right now because of what we're just seeing in terms of the criminalization of homelessness, what we're seeing from the federal government in DC to single adults who are on the street. And so really worries and concerns about what that could look like here.
So, we have to go to, we've talked a lot about wages and income and gigification. Let's talk about housing. We're in a possibly new era in New York, looking at a new era with a new mayor. What are you hoping could come of policy change? What can policymakers do? And then we have to talk about the pushback to affordable housing.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for us right now is the City FEPS lawsuit. So about
FEPS is the Federal Eviction Prevention Program.
I forget what the acronym stands for.
It has to do with housing and
it's the city-based housing voucher. So think of it as Section 8, but New York City's version of that. We put forth some amazing legislation that really expanded the City FEPS voucher. So historically, folks had to go through the shelter system, and after they go through the shelter system, then they can apply, and then they get it. And so we said, what we know is that we can identify people who are really at risk for experiencing homelessness. Why don't we try to keep people where they are in their communities and try to keep people in their homes? And so legislation makes the voucher available to folks in their communities. And so that's been blocked by this current administration for the past 2 years. It passed the city council. Then the city council actually had a veto override to override the mayor's veto, and the mayor has still decided not to implement that. And so I think that is, we're excited that, this hopeful administration will be able to push that forward.
Now, I'd like to ask you, Angela, if you see anything hopeful on the federal front, but I can't imagine what that would be in this climate.
I can't suggest anything helpful on the federal front. I mean, I will say that, we do know, you might not be surprised to know that research consistently shows that one of the best ways to, put people in housing is to help them get housing, right, through vouchers and things like that. But, just one kind of caveat I want to raise is that we tend to focus on literal homelessness, that experience itself. But really what our kind of national research is showing is that homelessness, those events are arising within a context of really long-term extreme poverty. And so I don't want people to think that like housing is the end of everything, right? We see really long-term detrimental health effects associated with the poverty, not just the homelessness itself. And so in some ways, when someone's literally homeless, they become a little bit more visible to service providers. But I just want to kind of raise this point that we're really talking about an issue of kind of extreme and persistent poverty in the United States, and housing is one piece of that, but it's not going to fix a lot of the other detrimental effects of poverty.
And we should say, if we haven't said it already, that being homeless could mean that you're doubling up with people, that you're living
100%.
in way too crowded conditions, that you're living in a car, that you're going couch surfing.
Yeah,
there's lots of ways you can be homeless in the city without necessarily being that guy on the street.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, I'm glad you raised that as well in terms of and that was starts thinking too about how do we get to folks across the board who are really experiencing these negative impacts that are really associated with extreme poverty. And so we see, the Department of Housing and Urban Development's definition of homelessness, which is much more narrow than what the Department of Education's is, which would include doubled up. Yeah. And too often, I can't tell you how many times when I talk to my students and when we're explaining the different definitions and actually what we mean by what homelessness is, and people are shocked. They're like, oh, wow, I was homeless when I was a kid and I didn't think about it. Yeah. I was living in a shelter. I didn't realize that building was a shelter. I didn't realize that because it was 3 of us living in a home, 3 different families living together, I was actually homeless.
So how do we address this, and how are you addressing it at WIN? I mean, you work on the policy side. You're coming up with initiatives that make a difference. Name a few. If you could publicize 3 of them, what would they be?
Yeah, I think, it's not like rocket science. Like, we know what works. Vouchers, like getting people like apartments, getting people housing works. And so I think that's been like the real frustrating thing is we know what works. We see the amazing outcomes that happen when you stabilize a home for a child in terms of education outcomes, developmental outcomes. And so it's, infuriating that the White House is proposing, gutting, in half the Department of Housing and Development, where we have a plethora of hard research that shows the effectiveness of these vouchers programs and how amazing they are to so many families. And so I think for me, is focusing on what we could do in terms of that. And I think in New York context, it's continuing to fund the City FEPS voucher. And not cutting that ahead of these cuts that are coming down. The city has already said that they may have to cut things from the City FEPS program to pay for some of the SNAP cuts. Also, the Housing Access Voucher Program, which we passed this year in New York State, which would allow folks to be able to get a housing voucher and be able to use it across New York State. So investing more money in that, knowing that the federal government is trying to make these massive cuts to housing programs.
And what about available housing? I mean,
yes.
The housing market is tight. It's targeting the super wealthy. What do we do about that?
Yeah, we have to, walk and chew our gum at the same time. And so, just as much as, we're out here advocating for vouchers, we're also advocating for increasing, developments at the lowest income bands. And I think that's the caveat. And so we've seen that in the previous administrations where there's been lots of efforts to build affordable housing, but it's been for folks who are not quite at that lowest income band. And so there's those folks who are at that.
We should say, what do they call
50,
affordable in New York City?
Exactly.
What do they call affordable?
I think it's folks, oftentimes it's folks making above $60,000.
Yeah.
But if we're talking folks who are making $8,000 a year or less, they really need deeply, deeply affordable units, and the government has to really step in and provide incentives for developers to be able to build those things long term.
There's some really good research showing that even people who get these HUD vouchers, it's a shockingly small share of people who are actually able to lease up, actually find a place to use that voucher, which I think is just a really strong indication of the affordability piece and the availability piece. But I also want to mention, we're talking about people who have good paying jobs who are experiencing homelessness. There are also a lot of folks who don't have good paying jobs who are experiencing homelessness. The median income nationally, we found, was about $8,000 in a year. So that $50,000, working mother, that's certainly an important case, and it's something we should be concerned about. But we also need to be thinking about solutions that are going to be helping, people who are a little bit less like politically easy to say that we're going to go help a single man in his 40s. It's kind of hard to make that case. But if we really want to tackle homelessness, tackle this issue, then we need to start thinking about people who are really vulnerable and disconnected, and maybe suffering the consequences of a lifetime of disadvantage and discrimination. And that's a little bit harder to do, both politically, and it's also a harder problem than providing housing to a working mother with children in some ways.
Yeah, and we can do it, and I think that's what people need to know, is that we've done it before when it comes to veteran homelessness. Like when we put the political will behind it, when we put the energies behind it, we know what works. Right. It's not rocket science. And so I think too often, in terms of like innovative solutions, and one of the things that we've been advocating for at WIN is for direct cash transfers and guaranteed incomes, as well as part of the toolkit. Not as the panacea by any means, but as a part of the toolkit.
How does that work for people that don't know? And the fact that there is such a program in New York, I think, is new to people.
Yeah. So we launched a program called Growing Strong, and in Growing Strong, one of the things that we said in terms of affordability is how expensive it is and destabilizing often it is to have a child. And so our program targets moms who have a child between the ages of 0 and 2, and follows that child for 2 years, and also has a woman that's also been through the shelter system with a child to be able to provide peer support. And so it's, and women in the program have been using it to do phenomenal things, from starting their own small businesses, just saving their own money, thinking about how they maybe want to go back to school. But it's, really, there's a host of different things that folks are able to do, because I think what we were really trying to navigate around is how do we really address this issue of the income disparities, because it is so massive. And so it's, a mom, if, they have their income of $8,000 or so a year, that's preventing them from doing so many things, from taking a kid to the movie to doing a lot of these things that I think for too often we don't, think about. And I think in this particular context, we've been really advocating for more of these types of programs at the city and state level, because we've seen what the federal government is trying to do with the social safety net, which is completely gutting it. And I think we'll see more of that in the upcoming future. And we don't know exactly where they're going to cut or what surprises will come up. We just, yesterday, some of the SNAP cuts were supposed to go into effect a year from now, but, yay, because the administration wants to punish New York, those things will go into effect within the next few weeks. So we don't know what's coming and what's not. And so I think, cash provides the flexibility and is a great mechanism for us to be able to navigate in the context of that.
Tell us the story of a working mom who benefited from that program, because some of these stories are really inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, there's a mom, and I think it's just so cute. And so she's created her own knitting business, and so all the women who are sort of the liaisons, they have the little knit caps that they wear, and she's been selling it, and she's created her own business. But I think what's been really cool to see is there's a mom who just was like, no, I'm just gonna save it. I'm gonna put this money aside, and I know that I get it for 2 years, and I know that once I get out, I'm gonna really need this. And so, I was at a conference the other day and was talking about young people who experience homelessness and cash transfers. And one of them, used the money for a bed, and it was the first bed they ever owned. And I think things like that, where it's sometimes we see some, these purchases, and they may not make sense in that context. But these programs oftentimes have been just game changers for so many folks.
And where could the money come from if we weren't just getting it from the federal government?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has been being proposed right now is increasing on the highest income New Yorkers. And so I think as we look at the fact that the federal government has said, you know what, we want to give massive tax cuts to billionaires so that they can buy another Lamborghini, while working mom or someone that's suffering from mental health issues and is not capable of working a full-time job. And may have a substance abuse and is just equally as deserving of help should get that help. And so, we should be able to take those monies from the richest New Yorkers to be able to pay for some of this programming because our federal government has decided not to take care of our citizens.
Even as they force more and more women to actually have children.
Yes.
Whether they feel like it's a good moment for them or not, while they criminalize all sorts of people, including a large portion of the LGBT community that we already know is super vulnerable. We haven't even talked about immigrants.
I think one of the things that I think I'm really, really concerned about is the impact that this immigration crackdown will have on homelessness, not just literally in terms of just like legit incomes and people being able to work, but also in terms of just the implications for some of the benefits that folks get who are in mixed status families or a host of different things. The economic impact for folks at the lowest incomes
and the
massive.
Expanding pool of vulnerability that you talked
Yes.
about at the beginning and fear. Angela, to close, we have a lot of viewers who go to fast food restaurants, who maybe go to the drive-through, who go to retail. Are the people that they're interacting with in those places, are they likely, could they be homeless? And if so, what can people do?
Certainly any of these jobs, where people are, making, whatever the minimum wage is, it's higher in New York than in a lot of places. Certainly those are people who could be vulnerable to homelessness. Homelessness ultimately is in New York City, has a large shelter system, has relatively generous services for homelessness compared to a lot of other places in the United States. And so I think that it's also kind of worth remembering that, if you're outside of New York City, the folks who are dealing with these like poverty and extreme housing instability issues might not have the same access to shelter and resources that you do in New York City.
Thank you. And we have that because we legislated, but we'll talk about that more on another show. Thank you both. Don't forget to tip people. Don't shortchange folks, among other things. Appreciate talking with you. Thank you, Henry Love. Angela Wyse, wonderful speaking with you both. That's it for CityWorks this time. If you have comments or questions, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app where you can watch this show and all of CUNY TV's programming. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.